My name is Esinam, and you're welcome once again to CLCD's grad school lecture series. So for the purposes of those who are new here, CLCD is an abbreviation for the Center for Learning and Childhood Development. And what the center seeks to do is to advance research and promote childhood survival and save lives. And the purpose of this grad school webinar series is to equip master's and doctoral candidates and to build their research capacity, as well as helping you all to become independent researchers. So today we have with us Dr. Emma Sachs, and she's an associate faculty in the Department of International Health at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. And she's also a senior advisor consultant at UNICEF. She's a member of the advisory group for CLCD and previously served as the vice chair and the chair of the board. So Dr. Sachs' research areas are in the field of maternal, newborn, and child health, and also on perinatal and pediatric infectious diseases such as HIV, Ebola, cholera, and COVID-19. Dr. Sachs has led many mixed methods evaluation with various types of study designs and in various settings. Much of her recent work has been on indicators and skill developments, especially for capturing complex topics such as stigma and experiences of care. She has led multiple quantitative and qualitative systematic reviews, including for Cochrane libraries and for WHO guidelines development. And she's also interested in how qualitative data can be collected with less bias and better integrated into graded evidence reviews. Dr. Sachs serves on multiple WHO advisory groups and editorial boards, and she's always looking for peer reviewers. She graduated from the University of Michigan and received her PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and she completed her postdoctoral work in epidemiology at Columbia University. So I think we can get started, and it's a privilege to have Dr. Sachs with us today. So Dr. Sachs, you're welcome to this webinar series, and I believe you can get started. So we would encourage everybody to take notes, because at the end of the lecture, you'll be given the opportunity to ask your questions. Thank you all.
Great, thank you so much for the nice introduction, and welcome to everyone here. I've been involved in different ways with CLCD, probably from some of the early days, and it's just so wonderful to see it not just grow, but to really focus on developing the skills and capacities of young researchers, and hopefully then, you know, you become the leaders of CLCD. I put my video on because I tend to talk with my hands and I'm kind of informal. So please interrupt me if you have thoughts and questions. But if it starts freezing or the capacity is not good, just let me know and I can turn off the video. So I prepared some slides to talk through what I was asked to cover, which was around systematic reviews. And I really wanted to focus on setting up the review and kind of carrying out the review part. And I probably won't talk as much about doing the analysis. If we have time, we can, I prepared a couple slides around that. But that can be quite different depending on whether it's qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, what you're trying to answer, etc. Whereas I think a lot of the principles of setting up a review and conducting the kind of selecting the studies, etc., are quite similar, regardless of sort of the type of studies, etc. So let me jump in. Can you see my slides? Someone thumbs up or yell out that you can see it.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, we
Okay,
can see. Yeah.
perfect. Let me make it bigger. Okay, so when I have the screen on, I can't see everyone's face at once. So please feel free to use the, hand raising or unmute yourself if you have a question as we go. I've tried to make this very practical, so it has a lot of hopefully kind of hints and practical suggestions that I've learned from doing many systematic reviews myself. So just to start, right, why might we conduct a systematic review? And one answer might be that we can't travel right now, right? I conducted a lot of these reviews and was asked to do them, at the beginning of COVID when they're sort of, we couldn't be traveling to collect as much data in facilities at certain times. But of course, I did many of these before that also, often to help in a guideline development process, right? So there's a group that's interested in developing new guidelines or is interested in starting some kind of project, and this might be background information or it may inform the guideline development, right? It's kind of, so the idea, right, is to identify, select, appraise, analyze, and summarize relevant research, right? So it uses a very structured approach. So it might be different than the kind of literature review or rapid reviews, perhaps, that you've done for school, right? Where you're maybe just looking for a couple references or very recent references. The goal of a systematic review is to be comprehensive, right? And I'll talk about sort of some of the implications of that in terms of the scope and size of these kinds of reviews. Sort of within the parameters that you decide, the goal is actually to try to catch all of the research that might fall under that. This then allows you to provide a summary of those data, ideally with reduced bias, although we'll talk about some of those issues, as well as potentially identify some of the gaps, not just in the research findings, but also in terms of what research has been done, where and when it's been done, et cetera. When would you do these or why would you conduct this kind of review? If there's been a large amount of review of literature on a topic that has not been summarized or synthesized or has not been done recently, right? There may have been a review a long time ago, but there's a lot of new data and that hasn't been synthesized. If there are conflicting studies, right? So in some areas, there may be many studies that are kind of always giving the same result, right? That may not then need a systematic review because you may say, well, we kind of know, right, the answer. But if there are a lot of conflicting reviews, right, you may want to have a process for rigorously evaluating it to say, well, is this intervention really a net positive or a net negative? And as I mentioned, it might be a prerequisite before some kind of larger study. So some people do these as a first step in a dissertation. They may occur prior to a trial, right? So before doing some intervention in a certain population, let's see what all the literature is on that particular intervention in that population that hasn't been summarized. Or as I said, in advance of new guidelines, updated guidelines, et cetera. So people often forget this step, so I'm going to mention it here, which is that before you start doing a review, you should check to see if there's one that's been done already. And as I said, there might be one that's been done, but not recently, right? So if you're looking at published papers, you could see how recently that's been done. Or if it's underway. And there are a couple different registries where people will register reviews. Is that my echo or someone else's? Does it sound okay? I'm not sure. So there's a couple different registries where people will register reviews that they've started or are ongoing. And unfortunately, there's kind of not one. So there is sometimes some duplication. Not everyone registers a review. It's not always required. But it's a good practice to check. And then I'll talk about registering your own review in a second. The NIH clinical trials database, which is required for projects that have US funding, doing clinical trials, et cetera, isn't a database of reviews, but some studies may have done reviews. So if you're interested in a certain intervention, it might be worth looking at. I've listed a couple of the sort of common registries for reviews here. There's others, and certainly if you're aware of others, please share them, in the chat or amongst your group. Prospero is one that's mainly for qualitative reviews. Protocols.io, I think, takes any kind of review. Cochrane Library is a great place to search. They publish the results of all of their reviews. It's the most difficult to register your review, which I'll talk about in a second. But it's a good starting point is to see if there's been a review or even a scoping review, a rapid review on something similar. And there may have been something similar that was done in a certain population. So even though systematic reviews are usually global, sometimes they have a smaller scope, and that doesn't mean that yours may not be a good parallel. So as I said, it's a good idea to register your review if there's not one that's ongoing. It reduces the redundancy of reviews if other people know, right? Others can then identify you and contact you if they're working on something similar, because there's a place in the review where you identify yourself. It's becoming a little more common that journals might ask for a registration number or link. It's usually not required, but some journals have been asking for it. So it's good if you have it, right? And you can say it's gone through this process. I've actually found that in registering my own reviews, the process of going through it, because you have to answer quite a lot of questions, can really help you refine your scope, can help you think about, is there an area that you haven't defined yet? Most of them let you start and like save the process, right? So you could start looking at what questions they ask and then go back and finish. I also recommend starting that process early. Some of these websites actually only allow you to register in the early stage of a review, and they don't really like you to have done the review and then sort of post hoc register the review. So if you know you're going to do this kind of review, it's worth looking to see if there's something similar that's been done, and if not, to start registering your review and ideally kind of register it fully. Most of these registers kind of allow anyone to do it, and they don't spend a lot of effort kind of reviewing, although some of them do it and they may come back with some questions. Cochrane Library only accepts some reviews. So most of these registers like accept and publish anything. Cochrane is a little bit different because they actually provide peer review and some technical help. And then the results of the ones that they assist with are published as a Cochrane review in their Cochrane journal. So they're a little bit special and recognized that way. I will just mention that Cochrane has, within Cochrane libraries, they have subgroups. So depending on the topic of your review, you might be able to contact them and ask, right? Is this a topic they're interested in? Should you pursue registering with them? They sometimes have higher requirements for how to do the review. I know I did a review once where we started trying to register it as a Cochrane, and then we got very delayed because of certain things. They wanted it to be global. We only wanted to look at low and middle income countries. So we ended up not registering it, but we did end up following most of their guidance about how to do it. In another case, we did actually go through and follow the sort of Cochrane registration. It did end up kind of delaying the process. So it may or may not work. That particular one was actually a PhD student who was leading it. And it worked even with the delay. It was okay with her degree program, but it is worth just considering those things as you explore it. So now to jump into the actual review. So there's a couple different frameworks that people use for formulating your research question and defining kind of the scope of your review. One of the most common is called the PICO framework. So I'll go through it, but just to say that a lot of the sort of work and thinking around systematic reviews was really developed around the idea of quantitative reviews, right? So if we have time, I'll talk a little about sort of quantitative and then qualitative reviews, but there a lot of the kind of frameworks and thinking about systematic reviews is based on them being quantitative reviews and specifically probably impact and effectiveness reviews. But then there's been some adaptations for how could we use these for mixed methods and systematic reviews. So I'll present some of those different kind of alternative frameworks and tools as well, right? So a PICO framework, right, is just a acronym, I guess, that kind of helps you go through these questions, right? So what you need to define if you're going to do a review is what is your population. Again, I think the P probably used to stand for patients because it was always considered maybe hospital-based, patient-centered quantitative research, but has now expanded, right? So what is your population, right? And that may be a demographic population, a geographic population, but it might also be like a patient population or patients who have people who have a certain condition, right? You have to define the intervention, right? What is it that you're interested in looking at? And that's not necessarily, despite the fact that the picture has a pill, it's not necessarily, right, a clinical intervention, right? It could also be package of interventions. It could be a behavioral intervention. It could be, it doesn't even have to be intervention kind of in the classical sense. It could be what are factors that affect something, right? You have to define the control. Sometimes I put some examples here, and sometimes a control is sort of implied, right? So if you're looking at a certain effect, it might be, you know, not against a defined kind of control, but just against a standard of care or normal care or something else. Quite specific about the types of papers that you are going to include and consider in the review. So I put some examples here just so you could kind of see, right? So if you said in, you know, among children with sepsis, right? So that's your population. And this is kind of a high level question. So when you go through each of these, you'll have to be more children in what age group, sepsis by what diagnosis, right? But that's your population, right? So age, condition, demographics, whatever, right? How effective is whatever your intervention is, right? Versus whatever the control is for preventing or causing whatever your outcome is, right? And I put another example here, you know, how effective is X intervention, just so you could see that you could write it in a different order also, right? How effective is X intervention in causing or preventing a certain outcome among a certain population? And there might, as I said, be an implied control. Does someone have a question or such as noise? Yeah, so, I mean, feel free to stop me if you have questions. As I said, there's been some adaptations for thinking about qualitative or mixed method studies. It's a little bit less maybe universally accepted. So I've seen a couple of different frameworks and acronyms used to try and help this process. The most common ones I've seen, although there's others besides this, are SPICE or SPIDER. And again, these are sort of to help think through what those parameters are, right? So what's the setting, right? What perspective are you using? Again, what's the intervention and comparison, and how is that being evaluated? Spider is similar, right? So what's your sample? The phenomenon of interest, we often think of as the intervention, although as I said, it might not completely be an intervention. It might be, factors that affect something. The design, how they're being evaluated, and research types. So depending, I don't want to get too kind of into the weeds on this, because I want to spend the time talking about the design of kind of carrying out a review itself, but just to keep in mind, there's a couple different frameworks depending on the type of review that you're doing. And that's not to say that any are right or wrong, but are supposed to be kind of helpful in trying to be comprehensive. Classically speaking, so again, thinking mostly about quantitative reviews, although this is mostly applicable for mixed methods and qualitative ones as well. The kinds of things that you'll have to report about your systematic review, I've listed here. And if I didn't mention, we can share these slides so you have them and you don't have to be scribbling. But I just wanted to kind of point out that unlike some kinds of manuscripts that you might write where there's not as much space maybe to talk about the methods, if you're writing up a systematic review, you often have to be quite specific about certain things in the methods, right? So you'll need to really define the types of participants, the types of intervention, the types of outcome measures, the types of studies. You'll have to have your inclusion and exclusion criteria, the methods. You will have I'll get into some detail on this, but you'll describe all of the studies that end up included in your review, as well as I would call an appraisal quality assessment, but you could call the methodological qualities of those included studies. So even kind of before you get to the findings, you have to describe how you selected all of the papers that got into your review, and then that kind of forms your database, right, of papers. So you have to then describe what's in it. So we'll get into some of those. So kind of regardless of the framework that you use, you want to be as clear and comprehensive as possible, right? So it takes a lot of thinking early on. And as you start doing the review, you'll have to come back to this many times. And sort of the more complex the review, the more you'll have to go back. So there's something always a little bit iterative about it. So don't feel bad if you kind of forgot you have to define something, or something comes up in the review in some of the early papers that makes you rethink the way that you've defined it. I'll talk a little about sort of how we test out some of our early assumptions. The scope, I would say, most systematic reviews are global, but they don't have to be. So you can define the scope as being regional. I've even seen some national ones if there's a lot of research, for example, in a certain country on a certain topic. I would just mention that if you're doing that, focusing on a region or country, to be aware of the sort of most common language or languages in those countries, to ensure that you're capturing the research on that country and from that country. So I always have a hard time kind of predicting how much work a systematic review will be until I start just trying to search for how many papers there might be, which I'll get into the details about sort of the first set of papers that you find and then how you narrow it down, which is usually quite a lot before you start actually reading them. But sometimes you'll do a very sort of broad search, right? If you look for everything in the world around a certain medication or something, you could get hundreds of thousands or millions of hits, right? And so even from the very beginning, you might think about, are there some restrictions that you think might make sense, right? And so a common one is like recency, right? So only looking at papers that, for example, have been published in the last 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it is. And thinking about the justification maybe for why you would use a certain cutoff. You can restrict to languages, right? Especially if you say, well, we're going to restrict it to the languages that our team is able to speak. I have tended not to do that. And if I've reviewed other people's reviews that are English only, I often have questions about that and what they may have missed by having those restrictions. So I kind of recommend that you don't put language restrictions, but then be aware that you may need to have translation either at the screening or extraction phase. And also keeping in mind, and this has happened to me a lot, that even without any language restrictions, the databases themselves that we search in, right, like PubMed, have publication bias themselves, right? They mostly have English language. They have some other languages as well. But a lot of the databases are pretty heavily weighted towards English, maybe some, French, Spanish, Portuguese, etc. So keep that in mind. That could be an important limitation. You may need to go looking for other databases, other papers, etc. You also, as I said, can limit it to certain subpopulations. And so when you're defining your inclusion and exclusion criteria, you want to do that before you start screening papers. Because as I said, you might get a lot of hits, and then you're going to be eliminating the ones that are not relevant to get the core set of papers that you're going to want to actually read and extract data from. And I just want to mention that the criteria that you define for your inclusion and exclusion is both around the topic, right? So I worked on a review recently that was on postnatal care, right? So we had to define what did we mean by postnatal care, right? So the timing, the location, who was providing it, but also the methods, right? So if you're doing a qualitative review, you may define these are the methods that we're interested in looking at, papers that report on this. I worked on one where we were really interested in who was practicing a certain kind of intervention. And so we did a larger review, but then actually reduced it down to papers that included demographic information about people who were involved in a certain health practice, right? So you can make those determinations earlier, if you can make them later, et cetera. If you can narrow down, you can continue to narrow down your review as much as you need to later in the process. I will just say if you change your inclusion criteria, especially if you include something you had previously excluded, you may have to go back. That happened to me on a large review we were working on where, and it was kind of a function of we had a lot of different reviewers and we hadn't decided whether we were going to include letters to the editor or not. And so some people had included it and some hadn't. And so then we had to actually go back, right, to the larger database, find all of the ones we had excluded, and then decide if we were going to include them again. So the more you can decide earlier on, the better, keeping in mind some of these things just happen and you'll have to redefine them. So after you kind of define your research question, and again, some of these processes might be going on a little bit simultaneously as you're refining, but you want to have your basic research question. And if you can, I suggest working with a librarian to develop a search strategy. I usually do a little bit of hits? Is it 10 hits, something like that? But I almost always work with a librarian on searches because they know how to use to do searches within these databases. So something like mesh terms you may have heard about. They do keyword searches that can help. They have some predefined lists, right, around like lists of words related to health services, for example, where they have lots of different ways of sort of different terminology, maybe for the same thing. I've also found most of the librarians that I've worked with have had like pre-populated lists of countries. So if I want to say, oh, I'm only interested in low and middle income countries, they can like add that to the search in a couple seconds rather than me trying to type in a bunch of country names that can take a really long time, right? And just putting in the name of a region doesn't do it, because if the title and abstract only have the name of the country, you actually need to include those. So if possible, I would work with a librarian. I think they're really, people don't realize how much like good searching skills often librarians have. They're not just there to put books on shelves. So if you're at a university, contacting your librarian is a great idea. I've had a lot of actual meetings or calls with librarians where I describe, here's what I'm trying to do, right? And they can really help refine it. They can also sometimes put the search in a format that's very easy to convert into a software, which I'll talk about next. Librarians will often ask for index papers, right? So that might be a couple of papers that you know are relevant, right? And that you want to make sure that whatever search you design would capture those few papers, right? So those papers can help you know, are there additional terms that you should use, right? But also make sure that you don't exclude them. So for our postnatal care review, we also had to consider infant care, postpartum care, but also things like with and without the word care. So postnatal services, things like that. And it helps to have a couple papers that when you do, you know, when you test run your search, you make sure that it's picking up the papers that you want to make sure are included. Librarians will usually be able to help with this, but just to know that different search terms are sometimes needed for different databases, right? So you can keep the sort of basic template often the same, but they may need to be adjusted. So when we've written up our search strategies and appended them, we've actually often included, this was our search strategy for Medline, this was ours for Embase, right? And then the number of hits that we found. I think I gave the letter to the editor example, but you may want to decide early on, are you including things like dissertations in your review or not? Decide if you're including gray literature or not. So there's a number of topics that you may say, well, there hasn't been as much published, but there's actually a lot of reports about this, right? So NGOs are often writing reports on various child health programs. Do you want to include those? You can often kind of manually find them and include them in your search. If you document that you did that, you can ask experts. If you're trying to be comprehensive, sending out emails and asking people if they have references is a known and accepted strategy for adding papers into your database. There's also actually a couple places you can ask librarians about where you can search some gray literature. So that's also, if you are interested in that, you can ask if that's an option. I know I'm going to keep saying this. You want to document all the choices that you make, and that includes saving search strategies, right? So that's strategies for each of the databases that you use, but it's really important. You may want to check it later. If you need to rerun it and check any numbers, you don't want to redo your search strategy because it'll probably change and you don't want to have to start over, right? If you need to do an update, right? So this is a common fear, I guess I always have when I submit a paper, that if the search was completed more than a year prior, the journal or whoever's, commissioned it may ask for an update, right? So they may say, has there actually been anything new? I've successfully pushed back. I'll just say sometimes when they ask, you can say, well, we don't, we have reason to believe that either there isn't a lot of new research on this, or there wouldn't be a lot of changes or something. Because often then sort of doing the analysis of the new papers that you find will take more time and kind of delay it anyway. But sometimes you really do need to do an update, and you may find, just in the last 6 months, there's been a couple papers that you do want to include. So you definitely want to keep your search strategy in a safe place and make sure that, you can rerun it. Journals also sometimes will ask you to append them. So it's kind of common now to include it as, for example, a supplemental file, and journals keep those like online. This is, thinking about the replicability of this review, right? That someone should actually be able to maybe not get the exact same final conclusions, but should be able to follow what you did. And if you do a lot of these, you'll actually develop a little bit of an ability to look at someone else's search strategy and see what might be the same or different. As I said, we did a postnatal care review, and there had been a previous review on something similar that was on maternity care. And I went and looked for the search strategy because I was curious whether their definition of maternity care had included newborns and postnatal care. They hadn't appended it, and I had to email the author and ask for it, and then could look through the search strategy by itself, and see where there was, determine that they hadn't included newborns, right? So they had to use the word maternal. So essentially it was different than ours. So once you've done that search, you may have a huge number and you'll need to eliminate duplicates. So especially if you've used multiple databases, they're going to find a lot of the same papers. If you manually have included any additional papers, you'll need to check that those aren't duplicates of things you already have in your database. And often they are, because they're, the papers that people know that are on that topic. Some of the software can do that automatically, and Note can do that. Covidence, which I'll talk about, has some ability to do that, but you will want to review it by hand as well. And I'll discuss that, some of the reasons why in a second. Yeah, depending on how many databases you use and things like that, you could have a very large number of duplicates, but sometimes if your databases are pretty different or you don't have that many, you won't find too much of that. So as I said, you usually have a really large number of hits to review. I worked on a COVID related review, and for whatever reason, we weren't able to put in a search term that was able to focus on humans, like without eliminating papers that we did want, because I guess we don't usually put the word human in our titles or abstracts. We just assume they're about people. So one of the first things that we actually had to do was eliminate all of the papers that were about other animals. A lot of them were about cattle, I guess, for some reason. So, often a lot of the hits or entries will get eliminated at this stage. And especially if there's a big number, but even if it's not, you may want to use a software. And I will talk for a minute about a specific software that you may want to use. But often at this stage, that's really helpful. You'll, as I said, have, clear inclusion and exclusion criteria, because you're going to be doing this screening only on the title and abstract. So you're not even really going to be looking with some exceptions, like at the papers themselves. So just based on the title and abstract, do you want to include or exclude papers? And generally you err on the side of inclusion at this stage, because there'll be another stage when you can eliminate papers that don't fit, right? So you don't here want to eliminate papers that you actually would want to include, right? So generally when you're screening, if you're not sure, you'll include it at this stage. Usually you have 2 reviewers who are independently screening. And then if there's, if you both agree that it is included, it's included. If you both agree it's excluded, it's excluded. If you disagree, you may need a 3rd person or a discussion to kind of break that tie. I put an asterisk on that and another one because the software can actually help with that. You will want to have a lot of like group discussions about why you're including and excluding papers, especially early on, because then you'll get more and more on the same page so that you're more and more consistent in the way that you're doing that. You'll also want to document the reasons why you're excluding. It's kind of okay at this stage to just have a big category called not relevant, right? But in the software, there'll be sort of more specific choices, and I recommend if you can that you use them. That'll say like wrong population, wrong study type, something, there'll be a list, and you can add things to that list. Even in the software, you can add all your own reasons as well. So, the more you have that, the easier it is later to say, oh, well, we excluded that for a certain reason. Often this stage eliminates a huge number and you're left with a kind of manageable number to do your full text review. If not, it's possible to use sampling. You're unlikely to come across this, in all the reviews I've done, we've only done this once. But we had, I think, 500 or 600 papers, even once we had done on the screening. And it wasn't possible for us to, read and extract data from 600 papers. So we did a sampling process where we did, I think, 100, and then we hadn't hit sort of quote unquote saturation. So we did another 100 and we were able to stop there or something. So if you end up doing that, there's some techniques for that. But just to be aware that it is possible, even though it's not common. So anyway, that gives you your list of papers that you're going to do a full text review, right? And some of those papers will be eliminated upon full text review, but many of them will actually end up in your kind of final review. So I just want to take a minute to talk about, and I'm aware of time here, but a software that I've found really helpful. It's called Covidence. You can do a certain number of reviews for free. I think it's 3, but you can check what it is. But most universities have free access, that you can make an account for free and do as many reviews as you want. You can upload your list of papers, right? So if a librarian helps you do it in EndNote, you can just put your EndNote library kind of directly in. It can help do elimination of duplicates. However, you do have to be a little careful. As I said, you want to go back and check because some names may not match, especially if there's like 2 last name, 2 surnames, accents, things like that. And occasionally a paper may have, because it's automated, sometimes the computers mess it up. Like the paper is e-published on 1 year, but then properly published the next year. And so it'll have 2 different years. So there's a couple little things you may have to clean up. But it's, especially with a large number, it's a really good way of organizing. And it's really good for screening, especially if you have multiple people, because it's server based, right? So you can eliminate kind of the duplication. It randomly assigns, 2 people to independently screen something, doesn't tell you how the other person voted, and then it automatically flags the one where you disagree with the other person, puts them in a like a separate folder, and then you can go back and resolve those. It works on mobile devices. I had a research assistant who said they used to do all their screening during their commute while they were sitting on a bus. So again, especially if you have a lot of people, and then it tracks the progress in real time. So you can see how many you kind of have left as you're going. It doesn't automatically include the full text of the papers, right? It includes the title and pulls the abstract. So you can screen directly like in the software. Well, you know, it does have some other functions, like you can tag the entries into categories, right? So the PNC, postnatal care review that we did, we wanted to separately analyze high income and low income countries. So as we were screening, we were able to like add a tag on those tags. Very. So if you just, I can look at the actual website, but I think it's covenants.org. Great for screening. It's not designed at all for doing qualitative study extraction. So I've used it for all of my studies to almost to do the screening. And then I have the database within Covenants that has all of my included papers. Sometimes they're tagged in categories. And then I've included the PDF with all of them in there. But then I've like printed out the PDF or kept files of them and done the extraction separately, usually with an Excel or Google Sheet or something else. I hope Covenants will will improve that kind of functionality, but the types of things that you extract are going to be very study specific. So it can be kind of difficult, I think, for that to be done in a sort of automated way. So once you have your database of full text papers, you're going to review those, right? So you'll need to actually access the full text of those. You know, paywalls is a big problem we have with a lot of journals. So, you know, going through an institution is usually the best way, or asking friends or colleagues who have institutional access who can download them for free. If you can't find them, especially they're older articles and they're not available online, you should feel free to contact, again, these great librarians to see if they have hard copies, or can get them through what they often call an interlibrary loan. And I've had librarians like literally scan and send me, you know, I said, oh, I can't find these 5 papers, and they can sometimes find a couple. You can also contact authors directly. So in addition to kind of Googling them, you can look on places like ResearchGate, or if they have personal websites, they may have uploaded their papers. If you're unable to find the full text paper, the author doesn't respond, etc., that's a you know, legitimate kind of reason to exclude, is to say, you know, no, like the full text was not available, but you do want to document that you sort of made the efforts to try to find it. You're basically using your same set of inclusion and exclusion criteria when you do your full text review. Right now you have more information from the paper about whether this will or won't fit. I think in addition to those, you know, criteria, the other thing that you're determining is there enough extractable information here? And if it's a very, very short article, or if you've decided to include abstracts, sometimes that's okay for quantitative papers. Usually for qualitative ones, it's not enough. So if you make that sort of part of your inclusion criteria, you can exclude papers that you just can't extract data from. As I said, you may still be excluding papers at this stage and you want to continue to document those reasons. I'm going to show you a diagram in a second. I'll show you they're actually separated out, kind of the exclusions that you do during screening versus this review. I have seen reviews where 2 people do the extraction, so that's possible. It's also pretty common where you may have only 1 reviewer do the extractions for each one. However, you really want to build in some kind of quality check, right? So usually it's at least a minimum of 10% of the papers, but you may decide you want to do 50, where you have 2 people who are independently extracting, and then you're coming together to discuss the kind of findings together. And again, you want to have those discussions as frequently as you can early on for consistency. There are some kind of templates for extraction, and some software kind of have them, but you will want to customize it depending on what you want to extract. You'll also want to pilot test your form, right? So with a couple of example papers, are you able to answer the questions in your extraction form? You know, in using those papers, right? And you may want to have some discussions about revising the form and compare how people interpreted it. There's a little bit of a balance between extracting extra information at this stage, right? So while you're reading the paper and doing the extraction form, it can be a little easier to extract extra information rather than having to go back and find that paper later if you decide you want to look at something else. But you don't want to sort of go overboard and waste time extracting papers, information you're not going to use. It is possible also to contact authors if there's something unclear, or there's, you know, you think they may have supplemental data or something. I think, you know, there's a couple specific things that you want to make sure you're pulling out. So I think, you know, often at the time when you're reading papers, if there's quotes that are jumping out to you in a qualitative review, now is like a good time to be pulling those out, include them in an extraction form, because then you have them for later. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the quality appraisals. And we're running out of time. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but there are a number of tools that you can use to appraise the quality of the papers that are included. And a lot of extraction forms include, or you may want to include, some kind of quality assessment. In most of mine, we've used a really simple kind of scoring, right? So rate the quality of this paper on its methods from, you know, A to D, and then you can set a cutoff. You can say any paper that's below a certain quality, we're actually not going to include. And if you decide not to do that, at least when you write up your summary, you might say, well, we're less confident in these findings because some of the papers were actually quite low quality. And in addition, if there's like large areas of missing information across the papers, right? There are kind of a lot of papers, the COVID review that I did, something in our extraction form, it was missing for almost all the papers that we reviewed. That in itself was a bit of a finding to say authors really aren't reporting on something that we think would be useful. So I just want to show this diagram. You've probably seen these before, but I find they're really easy to follow kind of how a study, a review works, right? So you can see how they were identified, how many were duplicates and were deleted, records that were excluded at different stages, and then in the, you know, final box, you see the number of studies that were included. So in this one, there were 11, but you can see they started with 2,000. I've done reviews that have had over 10,000 when we started, and ones that have ended with, yeah, as small as 10, but also as high as maybe 70 something. So, you know, depending, or the one that we had 600 where we had to sample, right? So there's a lot of variation here, but it's really useful to be able to document this. I'm going to stop here because I know we're at time and see if there are questions. I know I've only gotten to that stage of it, so at some point we can have a follow-up to talk about some analysis or other pieces of it, but hopefully that's good to get you started. can I answer any questions in the last few minutes?
Thank you, Dr. Sachs. I think we will do it this way. You can type in your question if someone else is talking and you want to ask your question so that we can read it afterwards. So the floor is open for questions. Thank you.
Please feel free to ask or type them in the chat. And you can also send them to me if you have specific questions over email later. Thoughts? Have people done reviews before? Is this how you've done them? Is this helpful? Is anyone in the process of a review now?
Hello, doctor.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Robinson.
Hi,
I want
welcome.
to ask about this. Sometimes when you are reviewing, particularly literature review, most of the published papers have old age, sometimes 10 years, 20 years. So with such, when you want to do the research, current one, do you supposed to quote the old one, or you need the current literature to support your research work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if you want to ask kind of the same question that's been asked and let's say answered before, right? I would use the date, probably not when it was published, but the date when they finished their search, right? So like if they, published in 2015, they may have finished their search sometime in 2014. So then you may say, we want to see what the new research is on this topic, and we are going to look at it. Really need to go back and reanalyze kind of what they've already done, unless you're asking a different question. The previous review, because you'll want to be able to say either this builds on it in a consistent way, right? So what they found 10 years ago continues to be true. There's been more research that kind of validates it. Maybe there's more research in more countries that has found the same thing, or maybe mostly the same, but there's some new things. Or you'll want to say, actually, the research in the last 10 years has shown something different. So I think you want to be very familiar with that, but you don't really need to include like their review within your review, right? You can kind of start from the place that they stopped, and then you should be able to compare. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I see there's some in the chat.
Yeah.
Would I recommend this for PhD students? So I think it depends on the question that you're answering, and kind of how extensive of a review you're able to do. I think often PhD students really, because you need to be very familiar with the literature in your field, you really want to read a lot of the papers yourself. So you may kind of do a literature review yourself, where you're reviewing a lot of the literature, but maybe it doesn't have to be sort of 100% comprehensive. You don't have to go through the process of eliminating a lot of papers that are not relevant, where you kind of need a bigger team to do that. So, if your dissertation research is kind of part of a larger project, then this might be a good kind of first project. However, it may not be necessary, right? You may be able to do a more narrow review, where you're really focused maybe on just the country where you're going to do your research, and then you maybe just look for a couple other examples from other places, but you aren't trying to do a full kind of global review. So it depends, I think, on the question that you're trying to answer. and quite truthfully depends on the resources available. Because especially if you need a team and multiple people, then it, may not really make sense to try to do it this way. I think, people sometimes use the word systematic review when that's not really what they did. They did, a kind of good like literature review on the topic, but they weren't aiming to be kind of fully comprehensive on everything. Yeah. So I think that's answering some of that question, right? Which is that a literature review can be more focused and not necessarily comprehensive. And the goal of a systematic review is really to find everything on that topic and not miss anything, even if it doesn't kind of contribute as much, let's say, to the overall findings. And I can see if maybe there's a good summary of different kinds of reviews. I know there's some efforts now to do some more rapid reviews where you can get results more quickly for more kind of urgent topics. And I've been curious to see sort of what they've been able to skip in order to do that. That's kind of a newer concept. Yeah, lots of detail for sure. I would agree. And just personally, I've found that systematic reviews tend to take a little longer than I always anticipate at the beginning. So that's probably good to keep in mind. Other questions? I know we're a little over time. I'm happy to give it another minute if you think of some, either want to ask or put in the chat. And again, I'm happy to answer questions if you want to send questions as well, and happy to do a follow-up or meet with groups separately. Any final questions?
Dr. Sachs, there's a
I mean, every review is trying to answer, right? Which is why it's so important that you define your research question and the scopes. I think, I mean, a systematic review, as I said, is a little bit different in its goal of being comprehensive and trying to summarize kind of all the data in a certain area. Often sort of, with the goal of trying to, reduce some of the bias, maybe come to a more synthesized conclusion, weight the different sort of in a real systematic way, not to keep using the same word, appraise and weight the studies that go into the review as well. So, a literature review is often appropriate, right? When you're going to undertake a study, you want to be very familiar with similar studies that have been done, especially maybe in the same region or same population. And you maybe want to be aware if some of the studies that you're, looking at have some methodologic flaws or limitations. But you don't necessarily need to go through the process of appraising, the quality of every study that you might cite in a background section, right? I think many of you have probably done literature reviews, right? You're looking at similar literature that will inform the work that you're doing, but you don't have to score them. You don't need sort of multiple people to say whether it, should be included. So it's a much more streamlined process that's, much more focused on giving you the background information that you need to then carry out the study or question that you have. Is a scoping or rapid review mandatory before a systematic review? It probably depends. I mean, I don't think a formal, I've seen people use the term scoping review like somewhat interchangeably with systematic reviews and other kinds of reviews. So I think it depends. I don't think you need to do like a full formal scoping review and then a systematic review, I think there would be a lot of overlap there. But I do think it helps to have some kind of lay of the land of maybe how much research is out there and whether there's kind of been reviews before, right? So like I said, I kind of informally like to spend a little time maybe just on PubMed, which is only one of the then databases that we'll search, right? To just see, okay, has there been a lot of research on a certain topic? Does it appear to be that it's kind of concentrated in one area or another? You know, and as I said, so during the search strategy, designing that search strategy, you may refine it or adjust it depending on what you find. So I think that, yeah, that's what I would say. I don't think you need to do kind of depending on how you define a scoping, like a full formal scoping, but I think it's helpful to know what, you know, is out there, before you do it. I really focused today on like setting up the systematic review and kind of getting you to the point of having your full text database. The kind of next steps that follow, one is describing and defining what's in your database, which often a scoping does something similar, right? So kind of if you get to that stage of the review and you're, you know, describing what's in your database, right? You're going to say this percent are from these countries, and this percent is this type of study, and this percent focuses on this, whatever, right? That's kind of overlapping with, I think, what a scoping would do of being aware of what's there. And that part of the process, I think, is necessary before you go on to then analyze actually what's in the papers or in the studies. So in that sense, I think it is mandatory as a step, but I don't know that you would need to do it separately. Any other final questions? Oh, you know what I didn't share? If we have one more minute. As I was putting this together, I was trying to brainstorm, and this has my contact information. So let me quickly just share this one slide. I was just trying to brainstorm like some examples of some topics like within of the kinds of things that CLCD works on that might lend themselves to something like a systematic review. Again, not having looked at whether maybe these have been done, but right, you could do a qualitative, if you were looking at qualitative papers, like an evidence review of factors relating to the uptake of postnatal care by a specific population. Anyone that wants to do that should contact me, because you can adapt a search strategy that I have. Or if you were looking at a more quantitative kind of study, right, you may want to do a quantitative summary and a meta-analysis, which we would have to talk about separately, looking at effectiveness of certain kinds of interventions on cerebral palsy, on certain kind of functioning, and then you could define your population, right, of children in a certain group of countries. So I just thought I'd give some maybe more relevant examples. And then that's my contact information. So feel free to contact me if you have additional questions. I shared a couple publications that people might find helpful. This is a longer slide set because it also has some things about analysis, but I shared a copy with S&M who can share it as well. It's really just designed to be internal, so not for publication, but if it's helpful to you, happy to share that. Any final questions? I don't see any others, so I'll stop sharing. And over to you to close out. Sorry, we ran a little over.
Thank you very much. This has been very informative. So we will share the publications that Dr. Sachs talked about, and then others with us in the emails. So our next lecture series is on the 26th of May. And we'll be talking about sampling, how to calculate your sample size and things like that. So please go on the link and then register for the next one. Thank you and have a good afternoon. Dr. Sachs, thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks, Emma.
Bye. Good to see you.
Thank you.